The security camera footage would later show exactly 17 seconds of pure chaos. But what it couldn't capture was the moment 3 varsity football players realized they had just made the worst decision of their lives. They thought they were filming another helpless victim for their sick entertainment, but instead they had awakened something far more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Vasquez had perfected the art of being forgotten. At Westfield Academy, where social status determined everything from seating arrangements to bathroom privileges, she occupied the space that most students never bothered to acknowledge. Not quite invisible, but close enough that teachers struggled to remember. Her name and classmates looked right through her during group projects. At 16, she possessed the kind of understated presence that made her blend seamlessly into crowds, hallway corners, and library study carrels where she spent most of her lunch periods. Her appearance contributed to this social camouflage in ways she had carefully cultivated over years of practice. Average height with a slight frame that seemed to fold in on itself. Dark brown hair perpetually pulled back in a simple ponytail that hadn't changed style since middle school, and an extensive collection of oversized sweaters that concealed more than they revealed. She favored muted colors that matched the school's beige lockers and never wore anything that might draw attention or invite comment. Her backpack was practical black canvas, her shoes were sensible flats, and her jewelry consisted of a single silver chain that disappeared beneath her collar, holding something precious that no one ever saw. Most of her classmates at Westfield Academy made assumptions about Elena that felt safe and comfortable for them to maintain. They saw a quiet Latina girl who kept to herself, probably struggled with English despite being born in Chicago, and came from one of those families where education was treated as a luxury rather than an expectation. They noticed that she never participated in class discussions unless directly called upon, never raised her hand to volunteer answers, and seemed to shrink whenever attention focused in her direction. During group work, she was always the one who ended up doing research while others presented, contributing significantly, but never claiming credit. The reality was that Elena had learned very early in life that standing out often led to standing alone. Her family had moved 6 times before settling in the affluent suburb where Westfield Academy commanded respect and demanded conformity. Each school had taught her new lessons about survival, about reading social dynamics, and about the price of being different. She had watched other kids who dared to be exceptional get torn down by peers who couldn't tolerate anyone rising above the acceptable median of achievement and ambition. What none of them realized was that Elena's quietness had nothing to do with inability or insecurity, and everything to do with choice. She had discovered that people revealed their true natures when they believed themselves unobserved, unheard, and unjudged. Her apparent invisibility had become a superpower that allowed her to study human behavior with the precision of a scientist conducting field research. She knew which students cheated on tests, which teachers played favorites, and which administrators cared more about donations than education. Behind her carefully constructed facade of ordinariness lay a mind that processed information at a speed that would have intimidated her AP classes if she had ever chosen to reveal it. She absorbed languages like other people learned song lyrics, could solve complex mathematical equations in her head while appearing to daydream, and had read more classic literature than most English teachers encountered in their entire careers. Her notebooks, filled with what looked like mindless doodling during lectures, actually contained detailed observations about social hierarchies, behavioral patterns, and the intricate power structures that govern teenage society. The oversized sweaters she wore served a practical purpose beyond simple modesty. Beneath the loose fabric lay the results of a lifetime of discipline that would have surprised anyone who had ever dismissed her as just another shy bookworm. Her father, Miguel Vasquez, had been teaching her Krav Maga since she was old enough to stand steadily on her own feet. Not as a hobby or sport, but as a necessary life skill in a world that often decided a young woman's worth based on her perceived ability to defend herself. Miguel had emigrated from Mexico City, where he had earned respect as a defensive tactics instructor for private security firms that protected executives and their families from increasingly sophisticated threats. He understood that his daughter would face challenges that went far beyond typical teenage drama, and he had prepared her accordingly. 3 evenings per week, their garage transformed into a training facility where Elena learned to move with lethal precision, strike with devastating accuracy, and defend herself against opponents twice her size. Her mother, Dr. Carmen Vasquez, contributed her own form of preparation through lessons in psychological warfare and strategic thinking. As a behavioral psychologist who worked with law enforcement agencies, she had taught Elena how to read micro-expressions, identify deception, and understand the mental patterns that drove bullies to select their targets. Carmen believed that physical skills without mental preparation were like having a loaded weapon without knowing when or how to use it properly. Elena's silver necklace held a pendant that few people had ever seen clearly, but those who had caught glimpses assumed it was some kind of religious medal. In reality, it was a small piece of steel that her grandfather had forged from the remains of his first business in Mexico, a metalworking shop that he had built with his bare hands and lost to corruption. The pendant served as a reminder of resilience, of the strength that could be found in starting over, and of the importance of protecting what mattered most. At Westfield Academy, Elena's reputation preceded her in ways that worked entirely to her advantage. Teachers saw her as a dedicated student who never caused problems, completed assignments on time, and maintained grades that were solid without being threatening to other students' self-esteem. Parents who heard her name mentioned in passing thought of her as the kind of nice, quiet girl they wished their own children would befriend. Even the guidance counselors had marked her file as low maintenance, assuming that her silence indicated satisfaction with her social and academic situation. This carefully maintained perception was about to be shattered completely, and the 3 young men responsible for that destruction had no idea they were about to discover just how wrong their assumptions had been. Westfield Academy operated on an unspoken caste system that had evolved over decades of privilege, tradition, and carefully maintained social hierarchies. The private institution prided itself on producing future leaders, which in practice meant creating an environment where certain students learned to command while others learned to comply. The administration marketed this dynamic as character building and leadership development, but the reality was far more complex and significantly more brutal than any parent handbook would dare to acknowledge. At the apex of this carefully structured ecosystem sat the varsity athletes, particularly the football team that had delivered 3 consecutive state championships and generated enough revenue to fund the school's expansion into new facilities. These young men understood that their athletic achievements granted them privileges that extended far beyond the playing field, and they had learned to wield that influence with the confidence of those who had never faced meaningful consequences for their actions. Jake Morrison held the unofficial title of social emperor among the senior class, a position he had earned through a combination of athletic excellence, family wealth, and an intuitive understanding of how to maintain power through strategic intimidation. Standing 6 feet 4 inches with the kind of broad shoulders and narrow waist that college scouts noticed from across crowded stadiums, Jake possessed the physical presence that made other students step aside in hallways without conscious thought. His father owned the largest construction company in the county. His mother served on the school board, and his older brother had graduated 5 years earlier, with enough donations attached to his name that a new library wing bore the Morrison family crest. Jake's lieutenants in this carefully orchestrated hierarchy were Tommy Chun and Marcus Rodriguez, both juniors who had earned their positions through loyalty, athletic ability, and a willingness to execute the kind of social enforcement that kept the system functioning smoothly. Tommy brought intelligence to the group, maintaining grades high enough to satisfy college recruitment requirements while possessing the technical skills necessary to document and distribute their various entertainment projects. His family had immigrated from Taiwan when he was 8, building a successful chain of restaurants that made them wealthy enough to buy acceptance, but not quite established enough to claim true social equality. Marcus contributed raw intimidation factor and an understanding of violence that complemented Jake's more sophisticated approach to maintaining control. Shorter than Jake but significantly more muscular, Marcus had earned a reputation for explosive temper and creative cruelty that made other students extremely careful about crossing him or his friends. His family's money came from real estate development, and his father's political connections ensured that any complaints about his son's behavior encountered administrative resistance that discouraged further investigation. Together, this trio had perfected a system of social control that operated through psychological manipulation, public humiliation, and the strategic use of technology to amplify their power beyond the physical boundaries of the school campus. They understood that modern bullying required more sophisticated tools than simple physical intimidation, and they had adapted their methods to take full advantage of social media, smartphone cameras, and the viral nature of teenage gossip networks. Their target selection process reflected careful consideration of multiple factors that would minimize risk while maximizing entertainment value. They avoided students with powerful family connections, those whose parents maintained close relationships with school administrators, and anyone whose disappearance from social events might generate uncomfortable questions. Instead, they focused on individuals who seemed isolated, whose families were unlikely to cause problems, and who appeared psychologically vulnerable to the kind of sustained harassment that the trio had elevated to an art form. Elena had attracted their attention through a series of small incidents that established her as an ideal candidate for their particular brand of entertainment. She never complained to teachers when students took her assigned seats, never protested when her contributions to group projects went unacknowledged, and seemed to accept social exclusion as a natural state rather than an injustice requiring correction. During the few times they had tested her boundaries with minor provocations, she had responded with the kind of passive acceptance that indicated someone who had learned to endure rather than resist. The football team's locker room served as headquarters for planning their various social experiments, a space where they could speak freely about their targets and develop strategies without fear of oversight or interference. Jake maintained detailed observations about potential victims in a notebook that he disguised as athletic training logs, recording behavioral patterns, social connections, and psychological vulnerabilities that could be exploited for maximum effect. Tommy contributed technical expertise about recording equipment, social media algorithms, and methods for ensuring that their content achieved maximum distribution without creating evidence trails that could implicate them in harassment campaigns. Marcus provided tactical analysis about timing, location, and execution methods that would minimize the possibility of intervention while maximizing the psychological impact on their chosen targets. He had studied surveillance camera coverage throughout the school, identified blind spots where activities could occur without administrative oversight, and developed contingency plans for managing situations that might escalate beyond their intended scope. Their previous successes had created a climate of fear that extended far beyond their immediate victims to encompass anyone who might consider reporting their activities or challenging their authority. Students who had witnessed their harassment campaigns understood that cooperation with investigations would result in becoming targets themselves, while those who remained silent could continue their academic careers without interference. Teachers had learned that complaints about the trio's behavior encountered administrative resistance that made intervention more trouble than most educators were willing to pursue. Elena's daily routine had been studied extensively by the group, who had mapped her movements between classes, documented her preferred locations for eating lunch, and identified the times when she would be most vulnerable to approach without witnesses. They had noted that she changed clothes for physical education in a corner of the locker room that offered privacy from other students but remained accessible to someone with proper planning and equipment. The plan they developed represented the culmination of weeks of observation and preparation, designed to create content that would establish their dominance while providing entertainment that could be shared across their social networks. Jake had determined that Elena's apparent vulnerability made her an ideal subject for the kind of humiliation that would demonstrate their power while generating the viral content that maintained their social status among peers at other schools. Tommy had acquired recording equipment small enough to remain undetected while providing high-quality video that would ensure their content met the technical standards expected by their audience. Marcus had identified the optimal timing and positioning that would allow them to document their target while maintaining escape routes that would prevent them from being caught in the act. None of them had considered the possibility that their careful observations might have missed crucial information about their chosen victim, or that their assumption of weakness might prove to be dangerously incorrect. The morning bell at Westfield Academy created its usual symphony of locker doors slamming, sneakers squeaking against polished floors, and hundreds of teenage voices blending into an incomprehensible buzz that Elena had learned to read like a complex musical score. Each tone, rhythm, and sudden silence carried information that most students missed entirely. But Elena processed these auditory cues with the precision of someone whose survival had once depended on understanding the kosher, emotional temperature of every room she entered. Walking through the main corridor required navigating social territories that were invisible to most observers, but clearly defined to anyone who understood the subtle markers of teenage hierarchy. Elena moved through these spaces with practiced efficiency, her path calculated to avoid conflict while gathering intelligence about the constantly shifting dynamics that governed daily life at the academy. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Behind a false wall that appeared to be standard storage shelving lay a training facility that rivaled professional gymnasiums designed for elite military preparation, complete with specialized mats, striking targets, and weapons that Elena had been learning to master since elementary school. Miguel Vasquez had not simply been a defensive tactics instructor in Mexico City, though that description served their current life well enough to avoid uncomfortable questions from curious neighbors or school administrators. His real background involved specialized training for Mexican Special Forces units, tasked with counter-terrorism operations along the border regions where drug cartels had established sophisticated military capabilities. Miguel had learned to fight against opponents who possessed advanced weapons, extensive resources, and no regard for civilian casualties or international law regarding conflict engagement. The techniques Miguel taught Elena went far beyond traditional martial arts instruction that most American children might encounter through after-school programs or weekend classes at local community centers. Elena's training regimen included Krav Maga fundamentals adapted specifically for smaller opponents facing larger attackers, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu ground fighting techniques that could neutralize size advantages through leverage and positioning, and Muay Thai striking methods that generated devastating power through proper technique rather than raw physical strength. Dr. Carmen Vasquez brought her own form of expertise to Elena's preparation, though her contributions operated in psychological rather than physical domains. Carmen's work with law enforcement agencies had exposed her to the minds of individuals who committed acts of violence against vulnerable populations, and she understood the mental patterns that drove predators to select specific targets and escalate their behavior beyond acceptable boundaries. Her training with Elena focused on reading micro-expressions that revealed hostile intent, identifying deception in verbal communications, and understanding the psychological triggers that could be used to manipulate aggressive individuals. Elena's morning routine began each day at 5:30 with physical conditioning that most professional athletes would find challenging to complete without modification. Miguel had designed her workouts to build functional strength rather than visible muscle mass, understanding that Elena's survival might depend on maintaining the appearance of weakness while possessing capabilities that could surprise opponents who underestimated her based on visual assessment. Her cardiovascular conditioning would have impressed Olympic distance runners, while her flexibility training incorporated elements from advanced yoga and gymnastics that allowed her to move through spaces and positions that seemed impossible for someone of her apparent physical limitations. The garage that served as their evening training space had been modified with soundproofing materials that prevented neighbors from hearing the impact of Elena's strikes against heavy bags, wooden boards, and specialized targets designed to simulate human anatomy. Miguel had installed equipment that allowed Elena to practice defending against multiple attackers simultaneously, using scenarios that replicated the kind of real-world violence that most suburban teenagers never imagined encountering during their daily lives. Elena's weapons training extended beyond the empty-hand techniques that formed the foundation of her combat preparation. Miguel had taught her to use ordinary objects as defensive tools, understanding that dedicated weapons might not be available during unexpected confrontations. Elena could generate lethal force using items as common as pens, keys, textbooks, or smartphone devices, transforming everyday objects into implements capable of neutralizing threats quickly and efficiently. The psychological conditioning that Elena received from her mother proved equally important to her overall preparation for the kind of dangers that teenage girls faced in environments where adults failed to provide adequate protection. Carmen had taught Elena to recognize the behavioral patterns that preceded sexual assault, identify manipulation techniques used by predators to isolate victims, and understand the legal and social dynamics that often prevented young women from receiving justice after experiencing violence. Elena's language skills extended far beyond the Spanish fluency that her classmates might expect from her family background. Miguel had insisted that Elena master English with the precision of a native speaker, while maintaining her Spanish capabilities at professional levels. But he had also taught her conversational skills in 3 additional languages that could prove useful if their family ever needed to relocate quickly. Carmen had contributed instruction in body language interpretation that transcended cultural boundaries, allowing Elena to read hostile intent regardless of the verbal language being spoken. The family's financial resources were significantly greater than their modest suburban lifestyle suggested to casual observers. Miguel's specialized expertise commanded premium compensation from private security firms that protected high-value clients, while Carmen's consultation work with federal agencies generated income that allowed them to invest in Elena's preparation, without compromising their cover as ordinary middle-class professionals seeking educational advantages for their academically gifted daughter. Elena's academic performance represented only a fraction of her intellectual capabilities, carefully calibrated to avoid attracting attention from administrators or students who might investigate further into her background. Her actual reading comprehension operated at graduate levels across multiple subjects, while her mathematical abilities extended into areas that most high school students never encountered until college courses. Elena had deliberately chosen to hide her intelligence behind a facade of solid but unremarkable academic achievement. The strategic thinking that Elena applied to navigating social situations at Westfield Academy drew from military tactical planning that Miguel had adapted for civilian environments where physical violence remained a last resort option. Elena understood concepts like terrain analysis, resource assessment, threat evaluation, and contingency planning that allowed her to maintain awareness of multiple potential outcomes, while positioning herself to control confrontations before they escalated beyond manageable levels. Elena's emotional preparation for violence had been carefully developed through exposure to realistic scenarios that most parents would consider inappropriate for teenage instruction. Carmen had used her access to law enforcement case studies to help Elena understand the psychology of attackers, the importance of decisive action during critical moments, and the necessity of maintaining moral clarity when forced to use violence in self-defense situations. The pendant Elena wore beneath her sweater contained more than sentimental value from her grandfather's metalworking legacy. Miguel had modified the original piece to include a small but extremely sharp edge that could serve as a cutting tool. If Elena needed to escape from restraints or create defensive injuries that would discourage continued aggression, the chain itself was designed to function as a weapon if circumstances required Elena to use it for striking or control techniques. Elena's preparation extended into legal and social consequences that might follow any confrontation where she needed to reveal her true capabilities. Carmen had taught her to document threats and harassment through methods that would create admissible evidence, while Miguel had emphasized the importance of using only the minimum force necessary to neutralize threats and escape danger. Elena understood that her training created legal obligations to exhaust peaceful alternatives before resorting to violence that could seriously injure or permanently disable her attackers. The combination of physical skills, psychological preparation, and strategic thinking that Elena had developed over 15 years of intensive training made her one of the most dangerous individuals at Westfield Academy, despite appearing to be among the most vulnerable students on campus. The student parking lot at Westfield Academy served as an unofficial marketplace where social currency was traded through carefully orchestrated displays of wealth, status, and influence that determined daily survival within the school's complex ecosystem. Jake Morrison's lifted Chevrolet Silverado occupied prime real estate near the main entrance, its custom paint job and oversized tires announcing his presence before he ever stepped foot on campus grounds. The truck represented more than transportation. It was a mobile headquarters where strategies were planned, victims were selected, and evidence was stored from their various entertainment projects. Tommy Chun's Honda Civic sat nearby, its modest exterior concealing electronic equipment that would have impressed professional surveillance operators. Hidden cameras, wireless recording devices, and signal boosters filled the trunk space, while his laptop contained editing software that transformed raw footage into viral content designed for maximum social media impact. Tommy understood that modern power required technical sophistication, and he had invested considerable time and resources into developing capabilities that gave their group advantages over traditional bullying methods. Marcus Rodriguez preferred his father's BMW sedan, a vehicle that suggested success without the aggressive intimidation factor of Jake's truck. Marcus had learned that subtle displays of wealth often proved more effective than obvious shows of force, particularly when dealing with school administrators who responded better to implied influence than direct confrontation. His approach to social control emphasized psychological manipulation over physical intimidation, though his capacity for violence remained readily available when circumstances required more direct intervention. The trio had developed their partnership through 3 years of careful collaboration that maximized each member's strengths while compensating for individual weaknesses. Jake provided leadership and the kind of charismatic confidence that attracted followers while intimidating potential opposition. His family's construction company had built half the commercial developments in the county, creating a network of adult relationships that protected him from serious consequences when his activities generated complaints or investigations. Tommy contributed intelligence and technical capabilities that elevated their operations beyond simple physical harassment into sophisticated campaigns of psychological warfare. His parents' restaurant chain generated enough revenue to purchase the latest electronic equipment while his academic achievements provided cover for activities that might otherwise attract unwanted attention from teachers or administrators who expected problem students to display obvious signs of academic failure. Marcus brought strategic thinking and an understanding of violence that complemented Jake's more theatrical approach to maintaining dominance. His family's real estate empire had taught him to identify vulnerabilities in systems and exploit them for maximum advantage, skills that translated effectively into teenage social dynamics where perception often mattered more than reality. Marcus understood that the threat of violence could be more powerful than violence itself, provided that the threat maintained credibility through occasional demonstration. Their operational methodology had evolved through trial and error into a sophisticated system that minimized risk while maximizing entertainment value and social impact. Target selection involved weeks of observation to identify individuals who met specific criteria for vulnerability, isolation, and entertainment potential. They avoided students with powerful family connections, those whose disappearance from social events might generate administrative concern, and anyone whose personality suggested they might fight back effectively or report harassment to authorities. The planning process for major operations took place during private meetings in Jake's family pool house, a space equipped with comfortable seating, large screen displays for reviewing footage, and soundproofing that prevented their conversations from being overheard by household staff or family members. These sessions combined elements of military tactical planning with teenage social dynamics as the trio analyzed their targets' routines, identified vulnerability windows, and developed contingency plans for managing unexpected complications. Jake's role as primary strategist involved developing overall concepts that would generate the kind of viral content their audience expected while maintaining plausible deniability if investigations occurred. His understanding of teenage psychology allowed him to predict how victims would respond to different types of pressure, enabling the group to escalate their harassment systematically without crossing lines that might trigger serious adult intervention. Before they achieved their entertainment objectives, Tommy's technical responsibilities extended beyond simple recording into sophisticated post-production work that transformed raw harassment footage into polished content suitable for distribution across multiple social media platforms. His editing skills allowed them to manipulate context, emphasize humiliating moments, and add commentary that amplified the psychological impact on their victims while entertaining their growing audience of followers who shared their content enthusiastically. Marcus handled logistics and security, ensuring that their operations remained invisible to school surveillance systems while positioning escape routes and alibis that would protect them if situations escalated beyond their intended scope. His training in his father's business had taught him to anticipate potential problems and develop solutions before they became critical issues that could threaten the group's continued operation. Their previous successes had created a climate of fear that extended far beyond their immediate victims to influence the behavior of students who had never been directly targeted, but understood the consequences of attracting unwanted attention. Teachers had learned that complaints about the trio's activities encountered administrative resistance that made intervention more trouble than most educators were willing to pursue, particularly when the students involved maintained excellent academic records and their families contributed generously to school funding initiatives. The group's documentation system included detailed profiles of potential targets, recorded conversations that could be used for blackmail purposes, and video footage that served both as entertainment content and insurance against victims who might consider reporting their activities to authorities. Tommy's technical skills ensured that their electronic evidence remained secure while being easily accessible when needed for leverage or entertainment purposes. Elena Vasquez had appeared on their radar through a combination of factors that made her an ideal candidate for their particular brand of social experimentation. Her apparent isolation, consistent patterns of avoiding confrontation, and lack of obvious family influence suggested someone who would provide entertaining content without generating problematic consequences. The trio had spent considerable time observing her daily routines, documenting her behavioral patterns, and developing strategies that would maximize her humiliation, while minimizing their risk of facing meaningful retaliation. Their confidence in approaching Elena stemmed from extensive experience with similar targets, who had proven unable to resist their systematic harassment campaigns. Jake's charismatic leadership had never encountered a victim who possessed the resources or determination to challenge his authority effectively. Tommy's technical capabilities had consistently overcome any attempts by previous targets to document or report their activities. Marcus's strategic planning had successfully anticipated and neutralized every form of resistance they had encountered during their 3-year reign over Westfield Academy's social hierarchy. The plan they had developed for Elena represented the culmination of their experience and capabilities, designed to create content that would establish their reputation, while providing entertainment that could be shared across their extended social networks. None of them had considered the possibility that their careful observations might have missed crucial information about their chosen victim, or that their assumption of weakness might prove to be fatally incorrect. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. She had memorized the schedule patterns of every significant social group, understanding exactly where Jake Morrison and his friends would be at any given moment throughout the day. Her backpack contained far more than the standard collection of textbooks and school supplies that filled most students' bags. Hidden within specially designed compartments were tools and resources that would have surprised anyone who assumed Elena lived a simple, unremarkable existence. A small digital recorder capable of capturing conversations from impressive distances, a smartphone with specialized security software that made her communications untraceable, and a collection of seemingly innocent items that could serve defensive purposes if circumstances required such measures. The silver pendant beneath her sweater grew warm against her skin whenever Elena felt the familiar prickle of being watched, a sensation she had learned to trust completely after years of her father's training in situational awareness. Miguel had taught her that predators selected their targets through careful observation, studying behavior patterns and vulnerability indicators before making their approach. Elena's apparent obliviousness to her surroundings was actually the result of advanced training in counter-surveillance, allowing her to monitor potential threats while appearing completely unaware of their attention. During her freshman year, Elena had identified Jake Morrison as a potential problem within the first week of classes. His body language, vocal patterns, and interaction styles with different social groups had immediately triggered recognition patterns that her mother had taught her to watch for in manipulative personalities. Dr. Carmen Vasquez had spent countless hours teaching Elena to recognize the subtle signs of emotional predators, individuals who derive satisfaction from exerting power over others through systematic psychological manipulation. Elena's notebook appeared to contain standard class notes and homework assignments, but the margins were filled with detailed behavioral analysis written in a shorthand code that her mother had developed for her own professional work. These observations documented Jake's methods for establishing dominance, his techniques for identifying vulnerable targets, and the specific strategies he employed to maintain control over his social environment. Tommy Chun's role as technical facilitator had been noted and analyzed, along with Marcus Rodriguez's function as the enforcement mechanism that gave their threats credibility. The trio's pattern recognition was impressive in its consistency, but predictable once Elena understood their selection criteria and operational methods. They favored targets who appeared socially isolated, seemed unlikely to report harassment, and showed signs of psychological vulnerability that would make them entertaining subjects for humiliation. Elena had watched them systematically identify and torment 3 different students over the past 2 years, documenting their techniques while remaining invisible to their attention. Her afternoon schedule included advanced placement chemistry, where Elena maintained a carefully calibrated performance that demonstrated competence without excellence. She understood that academic overachievement could attract unwanted attention from students who felt threatened by intellectual superiority, so she deliberately scored in the upper middle range of the class distribution. Her lab work revealed scientific understanding that impressed her teacher, but Elena was careful never to outperform students whose family connections made them politically dangerous to overshadow. Physical education presented unique challenges that required Elena to balance her need for privacy with the school's requirements for participation. The locker room dynamics were particularly complex, as changing clothes created vulnerability windows that predators could exploit while the social hierarchy became more pronounced. When students were removed from the protective camouflage of their carefully chosen outfits, Elena had developed strategies for minimizing exposure while avoiding the kind of unusual behavior that might attract investigation or comment. Her corner of the locker room had been selected through careful analysis of sightlines, traffic patterns, and surveillance coverage that most students never considered. The location offered privacy from casual observation while remaining close enough to other students that any disturbance would quickly attract attention. Elena understood that isolation could be dangerous, but so could being too visible during vulnerable moments, when she needed to transition between her public persona and her athletic clothing. The specialized undergarments Elena wore beneath her oversized sweaters served purposes that extended far beyond simple modesty or comfort. Her sports bras were designed to provide support during high-intensity physical activity while concealing the muscle definition that 15 years of martial arts training had developed across her shoulders, back, and arms. The loose athletic clothing she favored for physical education classes continued the illusion of slight build while allowing unrestricted movement if circumstances required her to move with speed and precision. Elena's awareness of Jake Morrison's increased attention had been growing steadily over the past 3 weeks, as his observation patterns became more focused and systematic. She had noticed Tommy Chun's presence in areas where he normally wouldn't be found, often carrying equipment that seemed unnecessary for his stated academic purposes. Marcus Rodriguez had begun positioning himself along Elena's regular routes between classes, creating what appeared to be coincidental encounters but followed patterns that indicated deliberate surveillance. The conversation she had overheard in the library the previous week had confirmed Elena's suspicions about their intentions, though the specific details of their plan remained unclear. Jake's voice had carried the confidence of someone who had never encountered meaningful resistance, discussing Elena as though she were an object rather than a person with agency and the ability to defend herself. Tommy's technical specifications about recording equipment had revealed the scope of their intended violation, while Marcus's comments about timing and positioning indicated they were planning something far more serious than their usual public humiliation tactics. Elena's father had prepared her for exactly this type of situation, understanding that predators often escalated their behavior when they believed themselves safe from consequences. Miguel's training had emphasized that the most dangerous moment in any confrontation was the period immediately before violence became unavoidable, when perpetrators committed themselves to actions that would determine the outcome of the entire encounter. Elena recognized that Jake and his friends were approaching this critical threshold, and she began making preparations that would allow her to control the situation when it finally developed. Her mother's psychological expertise had taught Elena that bullies typically underestimated their victims' intelligence, awareness, and capacity for strategic thinking. Dr. Carmen Vasquez had explained that predators succeeded primarily because their targets failed to recognize warning signs or prepare appropriate responses before situations became dangerous. Elena had no intention of falling into that trap, And she began implementing countermeasures that would give her significant advantages when Jake Morrison finally revealed the true nature of his intentions. The basement beneath the Vasquez family home contained equipment that would have surprised neighbors who assumed Elena's parents were typical suburban professionals, focused on providing their daughter with educational opportunities and cultural enrichment.